forward 3 months. It's her birthday, right? She's, I'm laying in bed. She wakes up. She wanted to go to some restaurant that night. She's like, did you make the reservations? I'm like, I haven't made them yet, but we'll be good, right? She starts freaking out. What do you mean? It's my birthday. What do you mean you didn't make the reservations? I'm like, sweetheart, it's a Tuesday in the middle of a recession. I'm sure that there's going to be a table, right? So she starts freaking out. In the back of my head, I'm like, I got this sweater. I'm good, right? So the more she yells at me, the funnier it becomes to me. But like an asshole, rather than laughing to myself, I sort of snickered out loud, right? Sort of giggled a couple times, and she just snapped, like, are you laughing at me? Are you laughing at me on my birthday? And then the more she yelled, the more I laughed. The more I laughed, the more she yelled, and it was just this vicious fucking thing all the way up, right? She got all the way to the point she was standing at the back door going, you're gonna laugh at me on my birthday? Fuck you! Boom! Slams the door. Runs down the stairs. At that point, I'm literally in the fetal position, like dying laughing, walking towards the bathroom. Then all of a sudden I hear, she came back up the stairs. And I'm not gonna lie to you, I got a little scared for half a second.
Good morning. It's Tuesday, Ayn Rand Tuesday, January the 2nd, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have the military shorts, motivational shorts, Bishop Barron, and Ayn Rand. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I shouldn't change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Thank you. And now, the military shorts.
He was part of the 530th Engineer Company, and they had just completed building a bridge across the Pasig River in the heart of Manila. It was February 1945, and they had encountered brutal Japanese resistance along the way, as well as prisoner of war camps that they would liberate. He was Corporal Francis Callahan, and growing up in the south side of Chicago, he was particularly close to his Uncle Sam and Aunt Cecilia and their 3 young daughters. Nobody had heard from them since 1942, when they were in Manila on business as it was overrun by the Japanese. Dodging snipers, Francis stumbled upon the notorious Bilibid prison, which housed some 300 civilian survivors from the Bataan Death March. "Cousin Francis," a chorus of voices rang out. As he turned his head, he couldn't believe his eyes. His 3 cousins, along with their parents. They were emaciated but alive. "God has answered our prayers," is all they could say through the tearful reunion. All would survive the war. The siege of Bastogne was his very first engagement. He was just 19 and a member of the legendary 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. His name was Vincent Speranza, and when his wounded buddy Joe Willis jokingly asked him for a drink, Speranza took the request to heart. Speranza scoured Bastogne and came across a bombed-out pub with a working beer tap. He filled his helmet with beer and delivered it to Willis. Soon other wounded soldiers asked for beer. Speranza dodged snipers on multiple runs until a horrified medic put an end to it. "Beer could kill some of the wounded," he scolded a surprised Speranza, who returned his soggy helmet to his head, beer dripping down his face. In 2016, Speranza visited Bastogne and was shocked to learn that a local pub was selling GI beer delivered in a ceramic helmet. He was a legend to the locals. Vincent Speranza died in 2023 at the age of 98.
During the Cold War, U-2 pilots were given cyanide pills in case they were captured. But once a U-2 pilot nearly swallowed one by accident. It happened in 1956 during one of the first U-2 overflights of the Soviet Union. As the pilot flew deeper into the heart of enemy territory, he could see MiG-15s flying below him. Though they couldn't reach him, he was all alone, and the Soviets knew exactly where he was. So as he approached Moscow, he felt his throat go dry and reached into the pocket of his pressure suit to pop what he thought was a cough drop into his mouth. But little did he know, the ground crew had placed the cyanide pill in the same pocket as his cough drops. With the pill in his mouth, all it would have taken was one little bite and the cyanide would have spilled out, killing him immediately. But after sucking on it for a while, he noticed a bitter taste and, horrified, spit out the pill before it broke. And that's how a simple mix-up involving cough drops and cyanide nearly led to tragic results for the only U-2 overflight over Moscow.
Could an aircraft carrier survive a nuclear bomb? Let me explain. First, imagine tracking the exact location of a carrier in the giant Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, spanning over millions of square miles. With only a few carriers deployed at any given time, locating even an American carrier is not easy. But let's say you manage to pinpoint it. The challenge doesn't end there. These carriers all have state-of-the-art air and missile defense systems within their strike groups, capable of intercepting incoming warheads long before they reach their target. And an aircraft carrier has survived a blast before. In the Bikini Atoll nuclear tests, the USS Independence survived a blast despite being stationed within half a mile of ground zero. However, the USS Saratoga, placed even closer to the blast, couldn't handle the underwater shockwaves and eventually sank, but it took 7.5 hours to go under. Today, modern carriers use lessons from these tests in their defense systems. Unless there's a direct hit, these supercarriers are designed to withstand a nuclear blast. This jet is invisible to radars because it's so fast. It holds the world record speed over any other military aircraft. During the 1980s, the U.S. Navy's F-14 Tomcats and the U.S. Air Force's F-15 Eagles were doing intense training exercises. These drills tested their ability to lock, intercept, and fire advanced weapons. However, their target was the high-speed, high-altitude SR-71 Blackbird. The mission took place within a tight, controlled area, allowing the fighter jets to show off their skills. But even the American fighter pilots struggled to secure a lock onto the SR-71. Especially when it flew with its counter-defense enabled. The Blackbird's deadly speed was going to be a big challenge. The SR-71 was cruising at more than 2,000 miles per hour. This was beyond the F-15 Eagle's radar capabilities, which could only detect up to 1,700 miles per hour. Getting a lock on it was nearly impossible. Sadly for the F-15s, the Blackbird went undetected due to its crazy speed and maneuvers.
It was May of 1944, and their B-24 Liberator was over Germany and engulfed in flames when the pilot ordered evacuation. Sergeant Howard Lynn, a tail gunner in the 492 bomb group, had never made a jump before, and the only thing he could remember was to not pull his chute too soon. He was relieved to hit the ground unnoticed. Lynn slept the night in some bushes and was spotted by a German boy the next day, who took him to his family's farm. The boy's parents eventually turned Lynn over to the authorities, where he served out the remainder of the war as a POW. Howard returned to Iowa, married his sweetheart, and became a farmer. In 1994, he received a letter from Wilfried Bierman. It was the young boy. He apologized for turning him in and invited him to Germany. Howard and his wife stayed with Bierman in that same house. "I'm sorry we turned you in," cried Bierman. "I forgive you," Howard replied. It was war.
I think about Vietnam every day. Just about every day, some thoughts, even at night. Thoughts will be about Vietnam.
You said you think about it every day. What do you think about?
I was there for 3 years, and I think about the combat part of it.
Tell me about the first moments of seeing combat. What was that like?
The first moment of seeing combat, you don't think it's combat. You think you're in another training outfit. So I kept thinking, I cannot be in war. I've trained for the M14. I made high fire on the M14, all that stuff. I said, but no, this is some kind of training exercise. Until I saw an NBC cameraman stand up to take a picture and fold over from being shot. Then I realized, hey, this is real. And then the training that you get kicks in. And whenever you're in combat, you're really working automatic. Your training is kicking in. And the fear doesn't come over you until after the battle. During the battle, you don't have time for that. You got to function.
How long had you been there in combat before you got shot?
Oh, about a month. Somewhere around about a month.
Did it go in your backside, out your hip, or in your hip, out your backside?
It went in my hip and came out the backside. And there's this little small hole on the front, but on the back of my behind, there's a big hump where it took a lot of tissue out.
Combat changes a man.
And then you never know what you're capable of doing until the opportunity presents itself, or you are pushed into that mode, and then, you surprise yourself. I know I surprised myself.
Jason Lacrosse piloted the first medevac helicopter to come rescue German soldiers during the infamous Good Friday battle, in which a single German platoon fought 200 insurgents. When the American pilots learned that German paratroopers were suffering casualties, they immediately wanted to help. But while still on the outbound flight, the crews were radioed to turn back because the landing zone was too contested. Lacrosse, leader of the mission, ignored the order and flew on. As they approached the landing zone, the Americans then came under such heavy fire that they had to abort. Only on their second attempt were they able to land under heavy enemy fire and evacuate the first casualties. At one point, a rocket exploded just a few meters from the helicopter. Nevertheless, they not only successfully brought the first patient to Kunduz, but flew back into the combat zone 2 more times to evacuate more wounded. For their selfless rescue of the German soldiers, Lacrosse and the entire helicopter crew were awarded the German Gold Cross of Honor. Crazy untold World War II facts they don't teach in school. During World War II, the acronym BAM playfully described the broad-assed Marines, referring to the women serving in the U.S. Marine Corps. In return, women affectionately called the men hams, or hairy-assed Marines. The Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, but few people know the name of the B-29 that bombed Nagasaki. It was called Boxcar, named after its commander, Frederick Bach. Before the Pearl Harbor attack in late 1941, privates in the military earned $21 per month, equivalent to about $5,000 a year today. However, in September 1942, their pay doubled to $50 per month. During WW2, over 650,000 Jeeps were manufactured. American factories also produced 300,000 military aircraft, 89,000 tanks, 3 million machine guns, and 7 million rifles. Isn't that crazy?
He dropped out of school in 8th grade to help his family make ends meet during the Depression. At 12 years old, he learned how to swim, thanks to a teacher at the YMCA named Dale McGinnis, who assured him it would come in handy someday. His name was William Ingram, and on his 17th birthday, he enlisted in the Navy, following in the footsteps of his older brother. Ingram was on board the USS Houston in February of 1942 when it was sunk in the calamitous Battle of Java Sea, one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history. Giving his life vest to a friend, Ingram treaded the oily water for 2 days before being scooped up by the Japanese. He was one of only 368 survivors. Ingram spent the remainder of the war working on the notorious Burma Railway, weighing only 90 pounds when he was liberated in 1945. Returning home to Illinois, the first stop he made was to the YMCA to see Dale McGinnis. "You were right," Ingram told the man who taught him to swim. "It came in handy."
And that was the military shorts. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the motivational shorts.
And to all of you watching here, come close to the screen and listen. People don't have to like you. People don't have to love you. They don't even have to respect you. But when you look in the mirror, you better love what you see. You better love what you see.
Imagine that you look among people who are pursuing partners, partly for sex. You could imagine there's two strategies. There are people who are looking for a sexual partner within the context of a long-term intimate relationship, and then there are people who just want to sleep around, right? And they want as many partners as they can in the shortest possible period of time. And that's the player mentality. Okay, then you say, well, what personality characteristics predict short-term mating preference? Well, we know it's dark tetrad. It's dark tetrad features. So the people who prefer one-night stands preferentially are, this is fun, narcissistic, psychopathic, Machiavellian, so they're manipulative, and, to cap it all off, sadistic.
When you said, I'm all in, were you really all in? Let me tell you what the cost of being all in is. Early mornings, late nights, being misunderstood, having very few friends, being your own cheerleader. Are you those things? People always talk about, man, I'm a hard worker. Everybody in this room is a hard worker. That's not going to separate you from anybody else. What are you working hard on? People always look for one thing for the other. Oh, you got to work smarter and not harder. No, you got to work smarter and you got to work harder.
There's a saying that you can't start a new chapter in your life if you continue to reread the last one. So may the road ahead of you be filled with action, not hope, passion, not obligation, and results, not plans. You may just fall in love with where it takes you.
I don't know what your future is, but if you're willing to take the harder way, the more complicated one, the one with more failures at first than successes, the one that has ultimately proven to have more meaning, more victory, more glory, then you will not regret it. Whatever you choose for a career path, remember the struggles along the way are only meant to shape you for your purpose.
The key factor for me wasn't whether or not I was ready. It was the fact that if I wasn't ready, I was determined to figure out how to get ready. And ultimately, even if I was ready, I still need to improve anyway, right? So the work's not going to stop.
Love is enough, though the world be a waning, and the woods have no voice but the voice of complaining. Though the sky be too dark for dim eyes to discover, the gold cups and daisies fair blooming thereunder. Though the hills be held shadows, and the sea a dark wonder, and this day draw a veil over all deeds passed over. Yet their hands shall not tremble, their feet shall not falter. The void shall not weary, the fear shall not alter. these lips and these eyes of the loved and the lover.
Just be calm. When things are going well, be calm. Don't think you're on top of the world in a sense. You always got to be wary because I've seen it. I've seen people come. I've seen people go. I've seen them come. I've seen them go. You got to be chill. Just take what's good in your life and move forward cautiously and carefully. And thank God that you have that. It's very, very important not to overextend yourself when you think you got it. There's no such thing. Everybody's dispensable.
You meet a family that is wealthy. Somewhere back in their lineage, generationally, they weren't. And then something happens. The one shows up. In every family, there's the one. And that one changes that family forever. In my family, I'm the one. We don't think like we used to think. My nieces and nephews are positive, forward-thinking, caring, good people with dreams. I wasn't raised like that. I'm the one. I'm the one who made the calls late at night. I'm the one who drove hours and hours for people to say no. I'm the one who dealt with the heat. I'm the one who typed all the emails. I'm the one who returned all the messages. I'm the one that dealt with all the stress and the strife and the cancellations and the back talking and the people who didn't keep their word to me and the difficult times. I'm the one who lost sleep at night. I'm the one who got up early. I'm the one who carried the emotional burden of winning, just like you are. You're the one.
You know what crazy means? Crazy means that you have the ability to see things that other people can't. And if you're not fucking crazy, you're never going to succeed at anything in life. Everybody has got to be a little bit off. Anybody that's done something great, they don't think like anybody else. They can't. And the people that tell you you can't do it, you know what your response to them is? Watch me. That's all you have to say. Watch me.
Whenever you feel negative or unhappy about anything, you say, wait a minute, I'm responsible. I'm responsible for my life. I'm responsible for what happens. I can't change the past, so I'm not going to spend a second worrying about the past. I'm going to become so busy working on my future and my goals that I don't have time to think about the past.
And that was the motivational shorts. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the last part of Chapter 6, segment Your Forces from the 33 Strategies of War.
He differed from them in that he possessed the daring and ingenuity needed to transcend the limits that technology had imposed on commanders for thousands of years. Whereas Napoleon's opponents sought to maintain control and minimize uncertainty by keeping their forces closely concentrated, Napoleon chose the opposite way, reorganizing and decentralizing his army in such a way as to enable its parts to operate independently for a limited period of time and consequently tolerate a higher degree of uncertainty. Rather than allowing the technological means at hand to dictate the method of strategy and the functioning of command, Napoleon made profitable use of the very limitations imposed by the technology. From Military Misfortunes, The Anatomy of Failure in War, by Elliot A. Cohen and John Gooch. We find our attention drawn repeatedly to what one might call the organizational dimension of strategy. Military organizations and the states that develop them periodically assess their own ability to handle military threats. When they do so, they tend to look at that which can be quantified: the number of troops, the quantities of ammunition, the readiness rates of key equipment, the amount of transport, and so on. Rarely, however, do they look at the adequacy of their organization as such, and particularly high-level organization, to handle these challenges. Yet, as Pearl Harbor and other cases suggest, it is in the deficiency of organizations that the embryo of misfortune develops. From Command in War, by Martin Van Creveld. The fact that, historically speaking, those armies have been most successful which did not turn their troops into automatons, did not attempt to control everything from the top, and allowed subordinate commanders considerable latitude, has been abundantly demonstrated. The Roman centurions and military tribunes, Napoleon's marshals, Moltke's army commanders, Ludendorff's storm detachments, all these are examples, each within its own stage of technological development, of the way things were done in some of the most successful military forces ever. From Patton, A Genius for War, by Carlo d'Este. Patton's philosophy of command was, never tell people how to do things, tell them what to do, and they will surprise you with their ingenuity. From The Iliad, by Homer. Agamemnon smiled and moved on. Coming next to the two captains who shared the name Ajax as they were strapping on their helmets. Behind them a cloud of infantry loomed. Agamemnon was glad to see them, and his words flew out. Ajax, both of you, Achaean commanders, I would be out of line if I issued you orders. You push your men to fight hard on your own. By Father Zeus, by Athena and Apollo, if all of my men had your kind of heart, King Priam's city would soon bow her head, taken and ravaged under our hands. From A Genius for War, The German Army and General Staff, 1807 to 1945, by Colonel T.N. Dupuy. It was during this period of post-war introspection and evaluation that one of the fundamental military concepts of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau coalesced into a clearly defined doctrine understandable to and understood by all officers in the Army. This was the concept of Auftragstaktik, or mission tactics. Moltke himself inserted in the draft of a new tactical manual for senior commanders the following lines. A favorable situation will never be exploited if commanders wait for orders. The highest commander and the youngest soldier must always be conscious of the fact that omission and inactivity are worse than resorting to the wrong expedient. Nothing epitomized the outlook and performance of the German General Staff and of the German Army which it coordinated more than this concept of mission tactics, the responsibility of each German officer and non-commissioned officer to do without question or doubt whatever the situation required as he saw it. This meant that he should act without awaiting orders if action seemed necessary. It also meant that he should act contrary to orders if these did not seem to be consistent with the situation. To make perfectly clear that action contrary to orders was not considered either as disobedience or lack of discipline, German commanders began to repeat one of Moltke's favorite stories of an incident observed while visiting the headquarters of Prince Frederick Charles. A major, receiving a tongue lashing from the prince for a tactical blunder, offered the excuse that he had been obeying orders, and reminded the prince that a Prussian officer was taught that an order from a superior was tantamount to an order from the king. Frederick Charles promptly responded, His Majesty made you a major because he believed you would know when not to obey his orders. This simple story became guidance for all following generations of German officers. From Hitter, The Life and Turmoils of Ted Williams, by Ed Lynn. Tom Yawkey was 30 years old when he bought the Red Sox, a hopelessly bankrupt team that had won only 43 games the previous season and averaged only 2,365 paying customers. The ball club became his toy. Because he loved his players, he spoiled them rotten. And because he spoiled them rotten, they praised him to the skies. There is a well-publicized exchange in which Bobby Dorr asks Tommy Henrik why the Red Sox weren't able to beat the Yankees in big games. Weren't we good enough? Dorr asks. It wasn't that they weren't good enough, Henrik answers. Your owner was too good to you. The Red Sox didn't have to get into the World Series to drive Cadillacs. The Yankees did. The Red Sox organization was an amateur operation. pitted against the toughest, most professional operation of all time. And lastly, by T.E. Lawrence. In a real sense, maximum disorder was our equilibrium.
And that was the 33 Strategies of War, the final part of Chapter 6, Segment Your Forces, by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
The more you walk the path of Christ, the more you will be opposed. You know that, don't you? And people say, what do you mean I'm going to be opposed? Well, just wait. You'll find out. If you're consistently on the path of Christ, trust me, they will come out after you. You know that line from Churchill I've quoted many times? Never trust a man who has no enemies. That means he stands for nothing. Dead right, it seems to me. It's right in the political world that Churchill was in, but it's even more correct in the spiritual world. Never trust someone who is not being opposed. That means almost certainly he's not walking the path of the Lord.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, one of the daily laws by Robert Greene for January 2nd.
January 2nd. Reconnect with your childhood obsession. When Marie Curie, the future discoverer of radium, was 4 years old, she wandered into her father's study and stood transfixed before a glass case that contained all kinds of laboratory instruments for chemistry and physics experiments. She would return to that room again and again to stare at the instruments, imagining all sorts of experiments she could conduct with these tubes and measuring devices. Years later, when she entered a real laboratory for the first time and did some experiments herself, she reconnected immediately with her childhood obsession. She knew she had found her vocation. Daily law. You were obsessed with it as a child for a reason. Reconnect with it. Mastery, Chapter 1. Discover your calling. The life's task.
And that was January 2nd. Reconnect with your childhood obsession. Back in a minute. Thank you. And so the platform I'm on for my podcast is Spreaker. And every week Spreaker gives me some statistics as to how many downloads I'm getting. So I'm not going to talk about the exact number, but I think what I'd like to do every week is let the audience know whether I'm up or down. So total downloads, I remain the same. But Spreaker also gives the top 4 countries. And so the number 1 country is the United States, in which the downloads were up. In Australia, my downloads were down. In India, my downloads were down. And in France, my downloads were up. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Philosophy Who Needs It by Ayn Rand.
18. The last chapter. Don't Let It Go, 1971. In order to form a hypothesis about the future of an individual, one must consider 3 elements: his present course of action, his conscious convictions, and his sense of life. The same elements must be considered in forming a hypothesis about the future of a nation. A sense of life is a preconceptual equivalent of metaphysics, an emotional, subconsciously integrated appraisal of man and of existence. It represents an individual's unidentified philosophy, which can be identified and corrected if necessary. It affects his choice of values and his emotional responses, influences his actions, and, frequently, clashes with his conscious convictions. For a detailed discussion, see Philosophy, and Sense of Life in my book, The Romantic Manifesto. A nation, like an individual, has a sense of life, which is expressed not in its formal culture, but in its lifestyle, in the kinds of actions and attitudes which people take for granted and believe to be self-evident, but which are produced by complex evaluations involving a fundamental view of man's nature. A nation is not a mystic or supernatural entity. It is a large number of individuals who live in the same geographical location under the same political system. A nation's culture is the sum of the intellectual achievements of individual men, which their fellow citizens have accepted in whole or in part, and which have influenced the nation's way of life. Since a culture is a complex battleground of different ideas and influences, to speak of a culture is to speak only of the dominant ideas, always allowing for the existence of dissenters and exceptions. The dominance of certain ideas is not necessarily determined by the number of their adherents. It may be determined by majority acceptance, or by the greater activity and persistence of a given faction, or by default, i.e., the failure of the opposition, or, when a country is free, by a combination of persistence and truth. In any case, ideas and the resultant culture are the product and active concern of a minority. Who constitutes this minority? Whoever chooses to be concerned. Similarly, the concept of a nation's sense of life does not mean that every member of a given nation shares it, but only that a dominant majority shares its essentials in various degrees. In this matter, however, the dominance is numerical. While most men may be indifferent to cultural, ideological trends, no man can escape the process of subconscious integration which forms his sense of life. A nation's sense of life is formed by every individual child's early impressions of the world around him, of the ideas he is taught, which he may or may not accept, and of the way of acting he observes and evaluates, which he may evaluate correctly or not. And although there are exceptions at both ends of the psychological spectrum, men whose sense of life is better, truer philosophically, or worse, than that of their fellow citizens, the majority develop the essentials of the same subconscious philosophy. This is the source of what we observe as national characteristics. A nation's political trends are the equivalent of a man's course of action and are determined by its culture. A nation's culture is the equivalent of a man's conscious convictions. Just as an individual's sense of life can clash with his conscious convictions, hampering or defeating his actions, so a nation's sense of life can clash with its culture, hampering or defeating its political course. Just as an individual's sense of life can be better or worse than his conscious convictions, so can a nation's. And just as an individual who has never translated his sense of life into conscious convictions is in terrible danger, no matter how good his subconscious values, so is a nation. This is the position of America today. If America is to be saved from destruction, specifically from dictatorship, she will be saved by her sense of life. As to the other two elements that determine a nation's future, one, our political trend, is speeding straight to disaster. The other, culture, is virtually non-existent. The political trend is pure statism and is moving toward a totalitarian dictatorship at a speed which, in any other country, would have reached that goal long ago. The culture is worse than non-existent. It is operating below zero, i.e., performing the opposite of its function. A culture provides a nation's intellectual leadership, its ideas, its education, its moral code. Today, the concerted effort of our cultural establishment is directed at the obliteration of man's rational faculty. Hysterical voices are proclaiming the impotence of reason, extolling the superior power of irrationality, fostering the role of incoherent emotions, attacking science, glorifying the stupor of drugged hippies, delivering apologies for the use of brute force, urging mankind's return to a life of rolling in primeval muck, with grunts and groans as means of communication, physical sensations as means of inspiration, and a club as means of argumentation. This country, with its magnificent science and technological power, is left in the vacuum of a pre-intellectual era, like the wandering hordes of the Dark Ages, or in the position of an adolescent before he has fully learned to conceptualize. But an adolescent has his sense of life to guide his choices. So has this country. What is the specifically American sense of life? A sense of life is so complex an integration that the best way to identify it is by means of concrete examples and by contrast with the manifestations of a different sense of life. The emotional keynote of most Europeans is the feeling that man belongs to the state, as a property to be used and disposed of, in compliance with his natural, metaphysically determined fate. A typical European may disapprove of a given state and may rebel, seeking to establish what he regards as a better one, like a slave who might seek a better master to serve. But the idea that he is the sovereign and the government is his servant has no emotional reality in his consciousness. He regards service to the state as an ultimate moral sanction, as an honor, and if you told him that his life is an end in itself, he would feel insulted, or rejected, or lost. Generations brought up on statist philosophy and acting accordingly have implanted this in his mind from the earliest formative years of his childhood. A typical American can never fully grasp that kind of feeling. An American is an independent entity. The popular expression of protest against being pushed around is emotionally unintelligible to Europeans, who believe that to be pushed around is their natural condition. Emotionally, an American has no concept of service or of servitude to anyone. Even if he enlists in the army and hears it called service to his country, his feeling is that of a generous aristocrat who chose to do a dangerous task. A European soldier feels that he is doing his duty. "Isn't my money as good as the next fellow's?" used to be a popular American expression. It would not be popular in Europe. A fortune, to be good, must be old and derived by special favor from the state. To a European, money earned by personal effort is vulgar, crude, or somehow disreputable. Americans admire achievement. They know what it takes. Europeans regard achievement with cynical suspicion and envy. Envy is not a widespread emotion in America, not yet. It is an overwhelmingly dominant emotion in Europe. When Americans feel respect for their public figures, it is the respect of equals. They feel that a government official is a human being, just as they are, who has chosen this particular line of work and has earned a certain distinction. They call celebrities by their first names. They refer to presidents by their initials, like FDR or JFK. Not in insolence or egalitarian pretentiousness, but in token of affection. The custom of addressing a person as Herr Doctor, Dr. Schmidt, would be impossible in America. In England, the freest country of Europe, the achievement of a scientist, a businessman, or a movie star is not regarded as fully real until he has been clunked on the head with the state's sword and declared to be a knight. There are practical consequences of these two different attitudes. An American economist told me the following story. He was sent to England by an American industrial concern to investigate its European branch. In spite of the latest equipment and techniques, the productivity of the branch in England kept lagging far behind that of the parent factory in the U.S. He found the cause. A rigidly circumscribed mentality, a kind of psychological caste system on all the echelons of British labor and management. As he explained it, in America, if a machine breaks down, a worker volunteers to fix it, and usually does. In England, work stops and people wait for the appropriate department to summon the appropriate engineer. It is not a matter of laziness, but of a profoundly ingrained feeling that one must keep one's place, do one's prescribed duty, and never venture beyond it. It does not occur to the British worker that he is free to assume responsibility for anything beyond the limits of his particular job. Initiative is an instinctive, i.e., automatized, American characteristic. In an American consciousness, it occupies the place which, in a European one, is occupied by obedience. As to the differences in the social atmosphere, here is an example. An elderly European woman, a research biochemist from Switzerland, on a visit to New York, told me that she wanted to buy some things at the 5 and 10. Since she could barely speak English, I offered to go with her. She hesitated, looking astonished and disturbed, then asked, "But wouldn't that embarrass you?" I couldn't understand what she meant. Embarrass? How? "Well," she explained, "you are a famous person, and what if somebody sees you in the 5 and 10? I laughed. She explained to me that in Switzerland, by unwritten law, there are different stores for different classes of people, and that she, as a professional, has to shop in certain stores, even though her salary is modest, that better goods at lower prices are available in the working men's stores, but she could lose social status if she were seen shopping there. Can you conceive of living in an atmosphere of that kind? We did go to the 5 and 10. A European on any social level lives emotionally in a world made by others. He never knows clearly by whom, and seeks or accepts his place in it. The American attitude is best expressed by a line from a poem. "The world began when I was born, and the world is mine to win." From The Westerner, by Badger Clark. Years ago, at a party in Hollywood, I met Eve Curie, a distinguished French woman, the daughter of Marie Curie. Eve Curie was a best-selling author of non-fiction books and, politically, a liberal. At the time, she was on a lecture tour of the United States. She stressed her astonishment at American audiences. "They are so happy," she kept repeating. "So happy." She was saying it without disapproval and without admiration, with only the faintest touch of amusement. But her astonishment was genuine. People are not like that in Europe. Everybody is happy in America, except the intellectuals. Oh, the intellectuals are unhappy everywhere. This incident has remained in my mind because she had named, unwittingly, the name of the breach between the American people and the intellectuals. The culture of a worn, crumbling Europe, with its mysticism, its lethargic resignation, its cult of suffering, its notion that misery and impotence are man's fate on earth, and that unhappiness is the hallmark of a sensitive spirit. Of what use could it be to a country like America? It was a European who discovered America, but it was Americans who were the first nation to discover this earth and man's proper place in it, and man's potential for happiness, and the world which is man's to win. What they failed to discover is the words to name their achievement, the concepts to identify it, the principles to guide it, i.e., the appropriate philosophy and its consequence, an American culture. America has never had an original culture, i.e., a body of ideas derived from her philosophical, as in Aristotelian, base, and expressing her profound difference from all other countries in history. American intellectuals were Europe's passive dependents and poor relatives almost from the beginning. They lived on Europe's drying crumbs and discarded fashions, including even such hand-me-downs as Freud and Wittgenstein. America's sole contribution to philosophy, pragmatism, was a bad recycling of Kantian, Hegelian premises. America's best minds went into science, technology, industry, and reached incomparable heights of achievement. Why did they neglect the field of ideas? Because it represented Aegean stables of a kind no joyously active man would care to enter. America's childhood coincided with the rise of Kant's influence in European philosophy and the consequent disintegration of European culture. America was in the position of an eager, precocious child, left in the care of a scruffy, senile, decadent guardian. The child had good reason to play hooky. An adolescent can ride on his sense of life for a while, but by the time he grows up, he must translate it into conceptual knowledge and conscious convictions, or he will be in deep trouble. A sense of life is not a substitute for explicit knowledge. Values which one cannot identify, but merely sense implicitly, are not in one's control. One cannot tell what they depend on or acquire, what course of action is needed to gain and or keep them. One can lose or betray them without knowing it. For close to a century, this has been America's tragic predicament. Today, the American people is like a sleepwalking giant torn by profound conflicts. When I speak of the American people in this context, I mean every group, including scientists and businessmen, except the intellectuals, i.e. those whose professions deal with the humanities. The intellectuals are a country's guardians. Americans are the most reality-oriented people on earth. Their outstanding characteristic is the childhood form of reasoning, common sense. It is their only protection, but common sense is not enough where theoretical knowledge is required. It can make simple, concrete-bound connections. It cannot integrate complex issues, or deal with wide abstractions, or forecast the future. For example, consider the statist trend in this country. The doctrine of collectivism has never been submitted explicitly to the American voters. If it had been, it would have sustained a landslide defeat, as the various socialist parties have demonstrated. But the welfare state was put over on Americans piecemeal, by degrees, under cover of some unidentified Americanism, culminating in the absurdity of a president's declaration that America owes its greatness to the willingness for self-sacrifice. People sense that something has gone wrong. They cannot grasp what or when. This is the penalty they pay for remaining a silent and deaf majority. Americans are anti-intellectual, with good grounds in view of current specimens. Yet they have a profound respect for knowledge and education, which is being shaken now. They are self-confident, trusting, generous, enormously benevolent, and innocent. That celebrated American innocence is a quality which, in philosophical terms, is simply an ignorance of how questionable a being man really is, and which strikes the European as alien, declares an existentialist, William Barrett, in his book Irrational Man. The word questionable is a euphemism for miserable, guilty, impotent, groveling, evil, which is the European view of man. Europeans do believe in original sin, i.e., in man's innate depravity. Americans do not. Americans see man as a value, as clean, free, creative, rational. But the American view of man has not been expressed or upheld in philosophical terms, not since the time of our first founding father, Aristotle. See his description of the magnanimous man. Barrett continues.
And that was part 1 of chapter 18 from Philosophy Who Needs It by Ayn Rand. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States. Today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.